So this is science speculation, but it's more science anti-speculation or anti-assumption. So it's a well-known trope in science fiction and horror that the scientific establishment tries to suppress new and unusual claims. When I was working at Microprose back in the early 90s, I had a friend who described a thing that he called male answer syndrome, and I'm totally a victim of this. And what it is, it's not the same as mansplaining. Male answer syndrome is when someone says something and you, although you have absolutely no idea you never studied the subject, never heard about it, but you make up an answer that sounds plausible based on what you know, but you really have no evidence for it. And so you explain it away. Mansplaining, my understanding of mansplaining is it's more you are explaining things to a woman because you think she won't know it or something. But male answer syndrome, I watch myself with male answer syndrome. I try not to explain things without actually knowing what I'm doing. Someone will say, so Sandy, why is X? And I have an idea why X might be, but I either say, I don't know, it could be this, but I don't actually know. I try to control that, thanks to my friend Doug Kaufman, who told me about male answer syndrome. Anyway, it's really prevalent on the internet, right? And it doesn't have to be just men doing it. Now, of course, there is no scientific establishment as an organized group, but there is nonetheless general consensus among scientists. That's not a bad thing. We shouldn't have to research everything from scratch when someone tries to overturn a new idea, but naturally enough, established ideas are sometimes wrong, and it takes a while to fix the situation. But going to my point, if you find something weird or unusual, then you run the risk of being mocked. It's much safer to be the guy who's making fun of the weird thing than the person who actually experienced it. As a result, when someone makes an outlandish claim, people who have done zero research leap in to shout the weirdo down. Take me, for example. When I was 11 years old, I saw a ghost. One of the most common responses I got in the comments on the video was, no, you didn't. Well, I mean, I saw something. It was unnatural and it was rare enough. I've never seen anything like it before. Sure looked like a ghost, and it behaved in a way that violated natural law. How should I address this? I can't just dismiss it and ignore it. It was there. Now, here's one result. Some years ago, I read a really good book about the Bermuda Triangle, this one here. It's written by a professional librarian who collected basically all the material on the triangle and correlated it. And the book explained it perfectly. It turns out there is no Bermuda Triangle. It's entirely a manufactured story. There, in fact, aren't more vanishings there than anywhere else. They're just better publicized. But the author didn't just say, the Bermuda Triangle sounds too good to be true, I'll just dismiss it with facile arguments. He researched it and he proved it false. That's how to debunk. Now, when I did my video on the skunk ape, I get comments saying, well, I think that the skunk ape reports are just wild goats, despite the fact that zero skunk ape reports resemble wild goats. Making this kind of statement without research doesn't do justice to the topic of whether or not there are actually skunk apes. Now, I'm not saying people should go investigate skunk apes. We all have other things to do with the time. For that matter, I'm far from convinced that there are skunk apes, but there's something causing these stories, and I'm certain it's not wild goats. All I'm saying is the quick dismissal is not the rational scientific rational approach, but dangerously it seems to be one. Oh, that can't be true because science! And that tricks people, or even yourself, into thinking you know an answer when you don't. In an example as late as the 1870s, though there's later ones, scientists confidently published lengthy articles explaining that giant squids couldn't possibly exist. But then, in 1878, a 55-foot-long squid washed ashore in Thimble Tickle, Newfoundland, and even the most blinkered, hard-grained scientists had to recant. Here's another case. Most of my life, ulcers were thought to be the fault of stress, diet, or other environmental effects. If you had ulcers, you had to drink lots of milk, you had to stay away from certain food. It was an ongoing lifestyle challenge that never really got cured. Well, two doctors, Dr. Barry Marshall and Dr. Robin Warren, found that certain antibiotics ended stomach ulcers. They did some tests. They found that all the people they tested with ulcers had pyloric bacteria and concluded that the ulcers were caused by the bacteria. It was an infection, not a lifestyle thing. When they published, the medical and scientific community was pretty hostile. No, ulcers have to be from stress. When the doctors presented the findings, they were kind of dismissed. But think about it, it makes sense. Let's say you're a gastroenterologist. You don't want to be told that you've been treating your patients wrong your whole life. The cognitive dissonance would be huge. In the end, Dr. Marshall actually drank a culture of pyloric bacteria and got ulcers. Then he took antibiotics. He was cured. The fact that he had to do that speaks volumes to how hard it can be to counter established facts. In another example, in the 1930s, I have a lot of insect books and spider books. I like spiders. 1930s, I have a spider book. It talks about spiders of America, and spiders of America haven't really changed since 1930s. It's still the same animals, right? Well, it had a section on the black widow, and in that section it says that black widows are rumored to be poisonous, but obviously they're not, because they're just a large striking spider, and they're probably not any more poisonous than any other spider. In fact, it was so obvious that black widows weren't poisonous that a guy in Russia had several of them crawl around on him and then got bit and then, almost died. It's because black widow spiders, in fact, do have a pretty potent venom. It usually won't kill you, but it's not fun to get bit by. Then the scientific books that I have from the 40s said, the only poisonous spider in all of North America is the black widow, and maybe the brown widow, because, it is related, but not as much. Well, then, in the 1950s, and they also said there's two kinds of black widow bites. There's the kind that has a systemic infection where your muscles tighten up like a nerve toxin, okay? Then there's a type where you just get a big necrotic lesion on your body. Well, in the 1930s, the systemic infections of black widows started vanishing. That got really, really rare. But people still kept getting the same number of the necrosis in their bodies. And some scientists said, what if these are actually two different spiders? And of course, what was happening is that the place to get bit by a black widow in the good old days was you'd go out to your outhouse, you sit down on the pot, and there'd be a black widow who built a web there, because, hey, that's a great place to catch flies, right? And you sit on the web, and, what would you do if you were a black widow and a big naked butt sat on you? You'd bite it, right? Well, it did too. By the way, if you want to know how to prevent that from happening to you, here's how the old people used to do it. You take a stick with you to the outhouse, and before you sit down in the dark outhouse, you stir the hole. And if you hear a snapping and popping like fire, that means there's a black widow web. Don't sit there, because they have really strong webs. You can hear them crackle. So now you know how to keep from being bit on the butt by a black widow. But anyway, by the 50s, outhouses were on the way out. People had indoor plumbing, even the remotest parts. So no one was sitting on black widows anymore. But they were still getting these necrotic lesions. So I started researching what could cause these, and then they said, oh, there's a thing called the brown recluse, and it can cause that some of the time. And then they said, okay, well, then there's only two poisonous spiders that can hurt you in the whole United States. There's the brown recluse, and there's the black widow, and there's not anything else. And then later on in the 80s, they found some more cases of bites that couldn't be explained by the brown recluse. And then for a while, they thought it was the hobo spider, and now some people are saying it's not the hobo spider, but there's something doing it. And then I found out that the Phidippus spider can cause a lesion, and the fact is, we have no idea how many kinds of spiders can cause a lesion or a local problem or cause an issue, because no one's going around testing all the spiders for their venom to see what it is, because spiders don't bite you very often, and usually when they do, it's not that big a deal. We know that some spiders can't hurt you at all. We know that some can, but we really don't know which they are, except in the most extreme cases. And it took a long time for scientists to be able to admit that, because they like to know it all. As another example, when I was growing up, it was widely known that the only venomous lizard was the Gila monster and the Mexican bead lizard, which is closely related. Every other lizard didn't have venom, even though there was legends. Well, almost everywhere there was lizards, there was people that reported that, lizards had venom. But obviously they can't, because the scientists say so. Well, then they found out, let's give an example. The Komodo dragon. When the Komodo dragon bites you, what happens is you feel ill for a while, and then you get worse, and then you die. Kind of like venom. Well, they explained it by saying, you get an infection. Well, you do get an infection, but the effects aren't fully explained away by it. So they started studying Komodo dragon's salivary glands and say, oh, look, it makes venom. And then they discovered that there's other lizards that make venom, and we don't know, because they don't have venom glands or special fangs. It's hard to tell which lizards are venomous or not. I have noticed my geckos that I owned probably were not venomous, but I have noticed that bites from geckos take a really long time to heal. Maybe that's the gram-negative bacteria in their systems. But anyway, turns out there's a lot of lizards that are venomous. The scientists wanted to be able to know that all the lizards that are venomous were just these two, so they explained it away, and now we're saying, okay, there's venomous lizards. Now, I'm not fully condemning this aspect of science. It's actually a good thing that an extraordinary claim needs an extraordinary evidence, but the system still has its weaknesses. There's other examples. There's one in my hometown. Now, someday I'll talk about the famous rock wall of Rockwall in another talk. I live in a town called Rockwall, and it actually has a rock wall. Many geologists have said, oh, the wall is just a natural rock vein, without seeing it. despite the fact that it has holes cut out for windows and it's made up of cut blocks of stone. The problem, you see, is that the rock wall is 60,000 years old. So explaining it away is really hard. That's before there's supposed to be humans in Texas. It's easier just to dismiss it than to take a road trip to Rockwall, get permission from landowners, it's not on public land, and then study it. Scientists are human. It's easier to take the low-hanging fruit. After all, if you study the rock wall and it's something weird, then you're going to get people are going to attack you in print, and that's not fun either. Easier just to ignore it. A lot of times they'll ignore facts. For example, it's the truth apparently that cows all over the world point generally the same direction when they graze. I mean, this hasn't been studied very closely. I've read theories that, they're aligned with the Earth's magnetic field. Well, why on earth would a cow need to align with the Earth's magnetic field? Why would that be useful to a cow? Even if that's what's happening, surely that deserves study. But it's ignored because mostly it doesn't affect us and we aren't sure what's going on. But it's unusual, right? Then there are facts which are obviously true, but people don't think about. The killer whale is a huge and dangerous predator, right? The killer whale eats animals as big as humans, like sea lions, even bigger, right? At this point, someone's probably getting ready to write it in my comments file right now. Killer whales never attack people. But the fact is, killer whales are really smart, and they hunt in groups, and they cooperate, and they're really big, and if killer whales did attack a person, how would we know? There would be no evidence of it. Clearly, they don't attack so often that we found out anyway, and perhaps they don't attack us for some unknown reason. But like I said, how would we know? Now, before you flame me too hard, I'm not an anti-debunker. I think debunkers are really useful, but they need to debunk, like the guy that did the Bermuda Triangle book, not just knee-jerk scorn or report or ignore facts. Because if something isn't investigated, what we need to do is man up and say, it's not investigated. Now, we could back it up like the rock wall by saying, we don't know of any humans in Texas 60,000 years ago, so either we're wrong about there not being humans, or perhaps the date for rock wall is an error, or maybe it was formed by a natural process we don't understand, or something pre-human which we don't know anything about made it. I think that covers all the bets. Now, I've seen the rock wall, and frankly, my bet is the pre-human, but more research should and could happen. And I don't mean new age guys coming out and saying, it's the Lemurians or something. I mean real research. And then going back to ghosts, do ghosts exist? All I can say is I saw a misty figure when I was a kid, which I can't explain away. I've also had two good friends who told me they lived in a haunted house as a kid. When I had them describe their haunted house, it was classic poltergeist activity. Actually, one of them said the house was demon-possessed, not haunted. But neither had ever heard of poltergeists. So something exists causing this poltergeist and the other things that isn't easily explained. All I'm asking is next time you hear about something weird, which is not really explained or researched, don't just make up reasons why it can't be true, but keep an open mind. Sure, most of those cases are going to be misunderstandings or fakes or myths, but not all, based on my 7 decades of experience. So, subscribe, like me, you can get notifications if you want. I mean, I never get notifications myself, but I'm not you, right? And buy my stuff sold right now in my website. Thanks.